What I did promise you is that we're going to kick off with a tri-talk on power, ethics, and accountability in business. Our speaker is Athol Williams, joining us via video stream. Athol is an academic and an author. He's currently a senior fellow of management practice and strategy at the University of Oxford's Saïd Business School. He's also the school's first Poet Laureate. Williams draws on 2 decades of executive experience in corporate strategy and management consulting that inform his teaching and his research. He was one of the brave whistleblowers who risked their lives to expose state capture corruption and went into exile for his safety. He launched the nonprofit Read to Rise to promote literacy in schools in under-resourced community. Let's give a very big round of applause to Athol.
Good morning, everyone. Wonderful to join you remotely. The topic of my talk this morning is a question that asks whether CSI fully discharges a company's moral responsibility. And many of us will have a quick answer, yes or no, maybe, to that question. Just a word about the work I typically do. My academic work and my practice work relates to either strategy, which I've been practicing for almost 20 years, strategic leadership and even self-leadership, and then this area of corporate responsibility, particularly with an ethical or moral lens on what corporate responsibility requires. These remarks are going to be primarily from the standpoint of the company. So I know we have NGOs in the room, and obviously us as citizens, we bear responsibility as well. But I'm primarily going to focus on the business, the company, the corporation in these remarks. So broadly, ethics sets out 2 broad sort of primary questions for us. The first is, what should I do? And so as individuals, as a corporation, we would ask, for us to be ethical, what should we do? What is required of us to be ethical? And I call that the first of these primary ethical questions. What should we do? The second, as you might guess, of these primary ethical questions would be, what shouldn't we do? And so if we're going to say, well, we're an ethical business, or I'm an ethical person, I at least have to, at a basic level, say yes to the primary question. 1, I am doing what I ought to do. And secondly, I'm also not doing what I shouldn't do. So that becomes this framing for whether we ask the question of whether CSI is fully discharging our ethical or moral responsibilities. Because as an ethical business, as an ethical institution, we've got to be discharging our full responsibility around what we should do, and secondly, what we shouldn't do. So if we ask, well, what is it ethically that we should do as a corporation and even as individuals, the core argument often is that we have a duty of care. So we have a duty of care to others. Where we see someone suffering, we have a duty to act in a way, to intervene in a way that might ease that suffering. Or where groups are vulnerable or, again, suffering under some burden, the duty of care. So what we should do under this duty of care is intervene in some way to ease that suffering, right? What might the second primary ethical question perhaps lead to when we say, what shouldn't I do? The most basic response to this question is, well, we should do no harm, right? So in all that I'm doing, I can practice these activities as long as I'm doing no harm in the process. So there are 2 primary ethical questions and guidance, right? Fulfill your responsibility by duty of care, and fulfill your ethical responsibilities by doing no harm. And so at first glance, we could assign CSI to answering that first question. So if companies say, are we fulfilling our duty of care? Are we doing what we ought to do? You could say, yes, we are, because we are practicing CSI. We've got these investments, these social activities that are doing good in areas of our society where there is need, where there is vulnerability, where there is deficit. And so we as business are stepping into that space and fulfilling our duty our duty of care. The important question for us then is saying, but what about the second primary ethical question, right? Yes, we're doing CSI and we're doing all that we should be doing in terms of duty of care, but are we as a business also refraining from those things we shouldn't do, which is primarily around doing harm, right? So an example might be, yes, we're doing fantastic work around education, around social development, but we're not paying our staff fair wages, or we are doing damage to the environment by allowing our effluent to flow into rivers, for example, or we are inculcating an environment at work of harassment, even involved in fraud or corruption, right? And so in this case, the second primary ethical question, which asks us to do no harm, you might say, well, CSI might not be sufficient if that is the requirement, right? So CSI answers our first question in terms of what we should be doing, duty of care, but there's a second ethical question around what we should not be doing, and CSI typically does not address that question. So I want to take that just a little bit further in a few ways. So imagine I'm in a business and I've done some harm, right? And so by the second ethical principle, I shouldn't be doing any harm. And so I've done some harm. And so I violated that ethical principle. What then happens is actually it creates a should do for the company. It says, given that you violated the second primary ethical question by doing harm, you now should make amends for the wrong you've done. So in that context, when a company has been involved in some wrong, currently, in the past, in the immediate past, they now bear responsibility to remedy that. And so that becomes a should do. So our should do responsibilities then become duty of care, yes, CSI, but also we have a duty to remedy the harms we have done. Now, if we take a sort of theoretical view, take a small step back, and we say, under what social conditions might we think about these two primary ethical questions or requirements we have? Imagine a society, a fully just society, a society in which government is fully discharging its responsibilities to protect human rights, to care for its citizens. In that context, the requirement of companies would be significantly diminished, because we wouldn't have a great need for social care, because the government is providing all of that. Again, we wouldn't have a great need for making remedy for the past, because presumably in a just society, a lot of that remedy has happened. So that's under that very theoretical just society where government is doing all it ought to do. There's a second scenario of a world where we don't have a just society and where government isn't fulfilling its full responsibility to protect human rights, to provide for citizens' social needs. And South Africa falls squarely into this scenario. And so under these conditions, the requirements of business to fulfill its ethical responsibilities is heightened. We now have a greater duty of care because of government's either unwillingness or inability or incompetence, whatever it might be, to not fulfill its responsibilities. And so in this condition, CSI does a tremendous amount of good in the world and in a society, but it's a perversity, because basically business is compensating for government's incompetence or unwillingness to address these issues. And so it raises for business, it raises for us this question around whether we ought to just continue doing what we're doing, or whether we ought to be challenging government to fulfill more of its responsibilities, us as business focusing on our social and economic activities, but government not being let off the hook in terms of what it ought to do. But also in this unjust environment where government isn't fulfilling its responsibilities, companies can also get away with a lot more. And so the second rule around doing no harm becomes so much easier because of these conditions. There's a third scenario I want to run. The first was this just society, the second, unjust society. The third one is what happens when you are fulfilling all of your responsibilities, but you observe someone else doing wrong, right? You observe another company acting unethically, or you observe government acting unethically. And this raises difficult questions for companies, but effectively, we bear this responsibility again to intervene, to do something to alleviate the impact of this wrongdoing. And this is the tragedy with state capture, because state capture, other than the looting, it's disabled and weakened a lot of state capacity to do these things that we expect it to do. And so it raises the burden on government. But again, I think we as business have two reactions. One, we can keep doing CSI as we are, which is fantastic. But also we need to be building capacity within government. And that's where business can really support government in terms of building state capacity. So if I was to summarize, if you're on the board of a company wondering whether you're acting fully ethically or fully discharging your ethical responsibilities, you might have a scorecard that says, well, we have a duty of care, and yes, CSI answers that question for us. But we also have a duty to remedy those harms we might have been part of currently or in the past, and CSI doesn't do that. So that we've got to fulfill doing other things. We also might ask, are we involved in doing things we shouldn't do? And that's an important ethical question. And again, CSI doesn't answer that. That we've got to ask separately of saying, are we paying our taxes? Are we paying people fair wages? Are we paying our suppliers on time? And then thirdly, this idea of, are we intervening in our society where those around us are destroying our society and acting unethically? And again, if we are not intervening, if we're not using our corporate power, our influence to ensure that corruption or unethical behavior is stopped, we are missing and not fulfilling our responsibility. And so in that case, again, I would ask the board or suggest the board needs to look elsewhere other than CSI. So in closing, obviously, in our context of South Africa, CSI plays a major role in supporting our societies and our communities. But I do suggest that from a board standpoint, from a business standpoint, even from a management standpoint, that CSI does not fulfill the full range of our ethical responsibilities. And that's not a fault of CSI. That's a call to businesses to be doing and fulfilling the other responsibilities in terms of what would be required as ethical behavior. I leave you with those thoughts. I hope it's something at least that is actionable, and I wish you well for the remainder of your conference. Thank you.